Welcome. It's so good to see all of your faces here on my screen, whether you're joining us here in the Zoom room and I can see your faces. Hello, everybody. Or if you're joining us on Facebook and all we can see is your name, we're really glad that you're here and are delighted to be spending the evening together tonight. I'm Rabbi Sarah Berman. I'm Director of Adult Education here at Central Synagogue, and it is both an honor and a pleasure to introduce this evening's program to you. Tonight, we are going to be thinking together about truth, about different versions of truth, if there can be different versions of truth, and what Jewish values tell us about this newly complicated conversation that we'll be having. Our speakers tonight are the co-editors of a volume on These Truths We Hold, Judaism in an Age of Truthiness. Our speakers are this evening Rabbi Dr. Joshua Garroway, who is the Saul and Arlene Bronstein Professor of Judeo-Christian Studies at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Los Angeles. He's also the author of Paul's Gentile Jews, Neither Jew nor Gentile, but both, and also The Beginning of the Gospel, Paul, Philippi, and the Origins of Christianity. Now, I was lucky enough to learn from Rabbi Dr. Garroway in one of my seminars, learning about interfaith activism and the values that bring us to be active in this world. Our other presenter this evening is a professor that I know even better, Rabbi Dr. Wendy Zierler, who is the Sigmund Falk Professor of Modern Jewish Literature and Feminist Studies at HUC-JIR here in New York. She received her PhD from Princeton University, an MFA in fiction writing from Sarah Lawrence College, and her rabbinic ordination from Yeshivat Maharat. She's the author and editor of several books and articles in the fields of modern Jewish literature and thought, and Jewish gender studies, most recently Movies and Midrash, which some of you have been able to study with us, popular film and Jewish religious conversation. And in 2017, she was appointed the co-editor of Proof Texts, a journal of Jewish literary history, a leading scholarly journal in the field of Jewish literature. It's such an honor to get to learn from these two wonderful scholars and incredible teachers this evening, as we explore truth, truthiness, and the Jewish way. Dr. Garroway, Rabbi Dr. Zierler, thank you so much for being here.
It's a delight to be with all of you today. Just hang on one moment while I share my screen with all of you so that we can follow along with our various visual aids today. So to begin, we want to tell you something about the background of this project, how it came to be. It originated in 2016 with discussions that we held, Josh Garroway and I, with the president and the administration of Hebrew Union College around the organization of a 2018 symposium. And the charge with the symposium was to put together a multi-day conference that would tackle an issue of critical importance in America and in the Jewish world. And it became very clear to us right off the bat in 2016 that the issue that we needed to deal with was the what appeared to be the ever worsening truth crisis in America. And so we set about with this, seeing how truth had become so complicated and adulterated with terms such as alternative facts and so on and so forth, ideas that you're all unfortunately very familiar with. We might have hoped that we could have shrugged some of this off by now, and yet we continue to live with these issues. And our idea was, as Jewish studies scholars, perhaps somewhat naive, more than a little bit naive, is the way to tackle a problem is to bring together a bunch of Jewish academics, scholars, experts in all of the various disciplines of Jewish studies. And with that, we could convene an event that would simplify matters, that would bring about some clarity when it came to the whole issue of what Judaism has to say about truth. Now, I'll explain to you in a moment how some of our expectations were thwarted. The result of all of this was perhaps not what we expected, but it wasn't without moral illumination that we'll be sharing with you. Before I get into all of that and I introduce our central finding, I want to explain to you the idea behind our title. Right, so you'll be familiar with the idea, these truths we hold from our civics knowledge in American culture. But what is this idea of truthiness? Where does the term truthiness come from? So this is not a word that we invented. For this term, we turn to the great Rabbi Stephen Colbert of the age of the Colbert Report. So even before long before 2016, long before the Trump presidency and all of the muck and mire surrounding truth that he brought about in his reign, so to speak, long before long before Donald Trump, Stephen Colbert was fretting about what was happening to truth under the George W. Bush presidency. And as part of a recurring segment that he had on the Colbert Report called The Word, where he did comic bits about particular words from that pseudo right-wing persona perspective that he would do on the Colbert Report, Colbert alighted upon, invented this word truthiness, which actually was the Webster's Dictionary word of 2006. So it's not just a term that he used on his show and fell out of currency in America. It actually became a real concept. And the idea of truthiness, it was Stephen Colbert's way of satirizing what he saw as an immoral, indefensible weakening of the idea of truth during the George W. Bush presidency, a reduction of truth to what wants to be true. What one wants to believe is true. We can think more recently about all of this in relation to the whole legal case between Fox News and Dominion Voting Systems, where the Fox News organization realized what its viewership wanted to believe about the 2020 election. And it therefore was asserting like a form of truthiness for its audience, catering to what they wanted to believe is true. So a sense of truth that's grounded in hope or in emotion rather than in some sort of empirical factual basis. So what we saw in 2016, and we had to be honest about this, was of a problem that had already very much been a problem, an issue that had very much been a problem in the United States for quite some time. One only has to think about the Clinton presidency, or think about the assertions about weapons of mass destruction in the George W. Bush presidency. So it's not as though we could claim that the problem with truth, or the confusion around truth, or the desire to come to some sort of understanding about what truth was invented in 2016, or by Josh Garroway and Wendy Zierler, and we set about to plan the symposium that later became the book. But we did very much feel that these issues had taken on a kind of heightened urgency and really threatened our democracy and threatened our clarity from 2016 on, under the Trump presidency. And because of the new media that were making it much easier for people to cling to their truthiness, as opposed to being persuaded by truths or by some sort of notion of empirical fact. And so, like I said, we set out with this plan for the symposium and then the book to bring together the leading Jewish minds when it came to the various disciplinary areas in Jewish studies, to see what we could learn about what the Bible says about truth, what the Talmud says about truth, what Judaism says in relation to science, what Jewish journalists can say about truth, what has literature and art and film and satire all within Jewish culture, how have they brought wisdom to bear on these issues, and then see what we could learn. As part of the opening of the symposium event, we began, in my introductory remarks to this two-day event, I showed a clip from the film The Truman Show, and I want to share it with you because it shows what sorts of issues we were activated by, what was concerning us. Because we realized that as much as we could point a finger at the right or at Donald Trump for what we thought was an ever worsening state around notions of truth, we realized that we had to do some personal introspection too, and consider how some of the values that we held most dear and that were at the heart, at the center of our training as postmodern scholars and as scholars of Jewish studies, that they might also be playing a role in this. And so I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. First, I want to show you this clip. It's from the film, the 1998 film, The Truman Show. In many ways, a very prophetic work, in that it was anticipating some of the issues surrounding reality TV and the role that media play in the construction of our world, the way in which media mediates our sense of what is true. We're going to watch this clip. I'm going to say a few things about the problems that it raises and how it is that the symposium was intending to respond to those problems. And then I'm going to turn the floor over to my colleague, Josh.
Good morning.
Morning. Good morning.
Oh, and in case I don't see you, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Yeah.
Morning, Truman.
Morning, Spencer. Hey, Pluto. Oh, no. Get down.
He won't hurt you.
Get down. Yeah, I know. It's just me.
Come on, Pluto.
Okay, so this clip from The Truman Show basically initiates Truman Burbank's journey toward the truth. Okay, so this is a character who ironically is named Truman, even though every single thing about his life is a lie, or it's a fiction that has been created by a film studio, hence his last name Burbank. And this moment in the film is where Truman wakes up just ready to repeat his routine that he's become so used to, when a stage light falls from heaven, from the sound stage of his life, interrupting the illusion of his life, the supposed truth or closed quality of his life, compelling him, turning on a critical light, so to speak, in his mind, and setting him off on this enlightenment journey, a journey of detection to follow the clues and figure out what is really up in his life. And what we see over the course of the film, I'm assuming that most of you have seen it, but for those of you who haven't, what we see over the course of this film is Truman taking a kind of journey from the dark ages of his world, where he's been conditioned to believe in everything around him. He boards a boat called the Santa Maria. So he takes a Renaissance man-like journey across this body of water after having been made waterphobic his whole life, right? And sets out to the very edges of his world like a Renaissance explorer, only to discover that he can't continue his journey because he runs up against the wall, he climbs these stairs, he exits the soundstage, supposedly leaving the world that leaving and debunking the world he was always meant to believe in. And the story has a kind of explicitly anti-religious valence insofar as Truman's world that he had been living in was a kind of simulation, a kind of Judeo-Christianity. It's a world that's created by a creator known as Christoph, sort of kind of Christ, right? Kind of God, who shares many of the qualities of the Judeo-Christian God, meaning he can cue the sun, he can bring the rain, he can be caring, but he can also be punitive. He knows all because he has all these cameras all over the place to be able to know all. And so what Truman needs to do is to take this journey to debunk the falseness, the lie that is religion. And it seems as though that's one of the ways that we understand this film. Modernity is about seeking out these clues for what is true historically and taking the scales off of our eyes about a religion. Now, we, of course, as professors of Jewish studies teaching in a rabbinical school, our goal in convening the symposium was not to take the scales off of our eyes when it came to religion. We wanted to figure out a way to bring forward all of the tools of the Enlightenment and all of our belief in the pursuit of truth and modernity, also with an awareness that religion might bring to the fore different notions of truth than when one might see conventionally in the secular world. And so starting with the Truman Show helped initiate that conversation. In addition, what the Truman Show problematizes and shows us is that on some level, it's almost impossible to ever leave the sound and stage backdrop of media. Truman may want to exit that door from the set that had been his life, but on some level, the only thing that he's ever known is that world that's media created. One might argue that all of us are on some level versions, little Trumans, versions of that, insofar as so much of our world is the product of the knowledge that media has generated for us. And given the way in which we're acted upon by media, how do we go about crafting a truth or asserting a truth? And that's one of the great complications of our current moment, right? And how do we converse across the divide of our various media-generated truths? The other thing that the Truman Show raises is the whole question of what one does if one goes off the grid, so to speak. What would someone like Truman how would he ever be able to speak to another human or even work, right? Outside of this world. And so there really is no way to conceive of truth outside of the world of media and the world of language and science. And so we need to find a way to embrace that. The last thing that I want to say is, from the point of view of postmodern scholarship and Jewish studies, Josh and I both realized that at the heart of our studies, at the heart of our training, was this notion that there were various perspectives that people bring when they look at it at a historical issue, when they conceive of an interpretation. And that one of the things that we reveled in as scholars educated in the late 20th century, early 21st century was this multiplicity of perspectives. And yet we were seeing the way in which that multiplicity of perspectives was being cynically used by people in a kind of nihilistic fashion for the sake of spin. And so how does one uphold pluralism and that notion of many narratives and perspectives without it just devolving into alternative facts or denialism or cynical nihilism? And it's with all of this that we set out to convene this event and then later built on it with the creation of this book. Josh, I'm now moving to you. Wait, yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. So I have the pleasure of walking us through a selection of the contents from the book that was a result of the symposium. We're not going to go through every chapter that appears in the book because that would take way too long, but I want to highlight some of the most important chapters, which coincidentally are from, or not coincidentally, offered by some of the most reputable scholars in Jewish studies in the world. So that is certainly the case with the first section of the book, which we called Torat Emet, a Torah of truth, which is an expression that should sound familiar. It comes from the second Aliyah in the Torah reading, Asher Natan Lanu Torat Emet, that God gave the Jewish people a true Torah. Well, we wanted to ask the question, to what extent is the Torah true? What does the Torah say about truth, about telling the truth, about the representation of truth? And so we got these two essays, one from perhaps the leading scholar of Bible in the world today, Mark Brettler at Duke, and the leading scholar of oral Torah, which is to say rabbinic literature, Christine Hayes, who is retiring this semester from Yale University. And the first essay from Mark Brettler asks the question, is it possible that the Torah and the Bible more broadly lies? And so what he did is he looked specifically at the book of Deuteronomy. And if you know your Torah, you know that the book of Deuteronomy retells a lot of the stories and the laws that come earlier in the Torah. And what scholars have realized is that in doing so, Deuteronomy is clearly recrafting things that have come before. It's adding new things, getting rid of old things, changing certain laws, and so on and so forth. And what Brettler notices is that it's not only Deuteronomy that does this. If you read further on in the Bible, you'll see that the book of Chronicles entirely reworks the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. And so the question Professor Brettler asks is the Torah and the Bible actually lying or misrepresenting the truth of Jewish history that comes before? Or is the book of Deuteronomy doing something more like what we reformers do in Judaism today, which is to say, taking works of the past and recasting them so that they are truer and make more sense for the world that we live in? And that's really actually a stark dichotomy, because it's asking, is Deuteronomy a liar and a propagandist? Or is Deuteronomy something much more closer to what we are, a group of Jews that are interested in recasting and making new meaning of previous tradition in a contemporary world? The second article then by Chris Hayes about rabbinic literature really sets the stage for the whole book, because you know that rabbinic literature becomes the source of Jewish knowledge throughout the medieval, early modern, and into the modern world. And so what Chris argues in this piece is that the rabbis were actually kind of rebellious in the era in which they live when it comes to the issue of truth. Why? Well, she says that the rabbis emerged in a time when Greek thought was permeating the Mediterranean world. And the Greeks, you probably know from studying Plato and Socrates and so on, the Greeks by and large believed that there was an absolute objective concept of truth, and that the goal of any person's life and any religious community was to make what they do and believe completely in coordination with the truth, capital T. And what Professor Hayes suggests is that, in fact, the rabbis take a different tack. They say, for example, that of course, truth is important and good, but sometimes the law has to be different from the truth, because truth is not the only value that Jewish people have to consider. Yes, truth is a value, but so is rabbinic authority, so is kindness, so is decency, so is marital harmony. All of these things are values, and one of those values doesn't necessarily trump the other. So sometimes we have to actually do what is not true, or we have to say something that is not true because some other value that the rabbis value has to take precedence in that situation. And so there are a couple of texts within the rabbinic literature that emphasize this point. The first is beep on the next slide. I've always wanted to do that. Anyone who's a millennial or older, I'm Gen X, will remember the best day in middle school, which was when you got to watch a film strip, and you get to be picked to be the person that got to turn the film strip. And so you sat there and watched the film strip, and then it went bing, and you got to turn it. I remember John Brown, madman or martyr, bing, and I got to flip it. Okay. So this first text is from the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, Eruvin 13b. And this is the famous passage, which I'm not going to read, but it's the famous passage that says, if the oral Torah tells the truth, how is it possible that Shammai and Hillel argued so much? If they all got it from their teachers, who got it from their teachers, who got it from their teachers, who got it from Moses, how did they disagree? And this says, well, don't worry about how they disagreed. Even though they disagreed, what they were saying was still true. But then it asks a second question. If what both of them are saying is true, why does Hillel always win? Why is Hillel's law considered true and Shammai's law is considered not true, at least in the sense that we don't follow it? And you may know that the famous answer is that Hillel, when he was teaching his Torah and teaching his law, would show respect for Beit Shammai, and that the students of Hillel, as opposed to Shammai, were known for being agreeable and forbearing. In other words, what's considered true when two things are competing is not necessarily which one is truer or more true or the real truth, but the truth that is in accordance with another important value. In this case, kindness, agreeability, decency, humility, and so on. So on the next slide, then, you will see another text where you see the competing values of truth on the one hand and kindness and decency on the other. And this is the famous passage where Hillel and Shammai are arguing over what you say to a bride at her wedding. So the sages taught, how does one dance before the bride? In other words, when you're dancing before the bride and she and the groom come over dancing and you have to say something to her, Beit Shammai says, refer to the bride as she is. So when the father-in-law comes and says, doesn't she look beautiful? If she's not beautiful in your opinion, according to Shammai, you're required to say, not the best makeup job this morning or something like that. Beit Hillel, of course, says, no matter what. This is a woman on her wedding day. You say, you are a beautiful, fair, and attractive bride. So Beit Shammai then argues back and says, well, doesn't that mean that you're lying, and so on and so forth? But at the end of the day, as you see here, Hillel's position wins. A person's disposition should always be empathetic with mankind. And this comes up over and over again in different issues in rabbinic literature, where one sees another example is if the new moon is determined to be the new month by the court, but an astronomer comes along and says, well, in fact, you got it wrong. Even though the court acknowledges that the astronomer really knows what the truth is about when the new moon began, once the rabbinic court has said something, you cannot undermine its authority, even if what it says is untrue. And these sorts of things come up over and over again in rabbinic literature, which is why Professor Hayes says the rabbis are different from the Greek world that they are surrounded by, in the sense that they don't worship the absolute superiority and supremacy of a concept of truth. Let's look at the next slide, where we took a slightly different approach to the question of, is the Torah true? And I'm only going to speak here about Benjamin Summers' article, but both Dr. Summer and Dr. Adler, we asked them to consider, in the light of biblical criticism, which is to say our awareness in the last generation or three, that in fact the Torah is not God's dictation to Moses, but in fact the Torah is a product that was written by the ancient Israelites. Can we still consider the Torah to be a Torat emet for us, a source of truth for us about ultimate reality, about God, about how the world really is. And actually, instead, so we can get to everything, instead of talking about Dr. Summers' article, let me just tell you that both of these articles, in a really intelligent and sophisticated way, come out with the claim that even though we acknowledge that the Torah is written by human beings in historical time, nonetheless, it can still be a source of divine truth and reality if we understand how to read it correctly. So the next slide then talks about another issue related to truth and Judaism, and one that comes up for Reform Jews all the time, which is, if the point of prayer is to commune with God and to say true things, what do we do when we confront prayers that have ideas that we no longer think are true? Now, Professor Marks has a great article in which she talks about the traditional reform strategy, which is, if a prayer requires us to say something that we don't believe is true, for example, in the Birkat Hamazon, I've been young and I've been old and I've never seen a righteous person starve. The idea being that if you're righteous, you'll obviously have enough money to buy food because God would never let a righteous person starve. In other words, if you're a homeless, starving person on the street, you're obviously not righteous. Well, if you don't think that's true and you don't want to say it, Professor Marks says, go ahead and revise it. And what she shows is that rabbis and Jews since antiquity have been doing this routinely, revising prayer in order that it coheres with their conception of truth. But Larry Hoffman, who many of you may know from HUC in New York, he takes a different approach. He says, why bother revising all of these prayers if we don't think they're true? The point of prayer isn't to describe accurately the world around us. The point of prayer is to describe an ideal world or a beautiful world or the way we react to our world. And so if something seems to not correspond to the way the world is in terms of what we pray, well, rather we ought to think about how that prayer reveals some kind of other truth that is meaningful for us, even if it's not a truth that we see in the world around us. Two more articles I'll talk about before passing it back over to Wendy. One is by the former president of HUC, David Ellenson, who I'm guessing many of you know. And he wrote about how a modern rabbi, in this case, the Sephardic chief rabbi of Tel Aviv in the past century, whose name was Rabbi Chaim David Halevi, how he was presented with a question of some students who had cheated on an exam. And in a responsum, he had to write about how you deal with these issues of lying and telling the truth. And he used all of the rabbinic material that we saw in Professor Hayes' article earlier, saying that, of course, truth-telling is a value in Judaism, but at the same time, just as the rabbis showed centuries ago, there are certain times when other values prevail over the truth and require us to say things that are untrue or do things in accordance with what we know to be an untruth. If, for example, the peace of a home, or P-E-A-C-E, not P-I-E-C-E, the peace within a home or some other value takes a priority. And then lastly, we decided that because we live in a modern world, we should consider not only truth within Jewish studies, but also truth in the world of, say, philosophy, and even more importantly, truth against the world of the natural sciences, which are so important in the modern world. And so we asked my friend Jeff Middleman, who runs this institute in New York of science and Judaism, if he would write a piece on the way science understands the truth and how it compares with Judaism. And interestingly enough, he was actually able to see a certain parallel between the two, and it looks something like this. He said, the way scientists think about the truth is not that when they discover something or write an article or have a successful experiment, they have discovered something true about the world that will be true everywhere and always. Rather, the way scientists think about it is that any statement they make about the truth is provisional. So I've discovered this about the way genes act, and for now that's true. But 10 years later, someone else might discover that in fact I was wrong. And that's okay. Because what we are doing in trying to discover the truth is participate in an ongoing process in which the truth is slowly revealed. And he compares that actually to a remarkable text in the Mishnah, which asks the question, why do the rabbis, if they are trying to determine the law, so often preserve minority opinions that are rejected? For example, we saw earlier, if Shammai is wrong about telling the truth to a bride, why preserve that opinion at all? And in fact, what the rabbis say is because sometime down the road, there may emerge a court that's wiser than ours. And they will need to have all of our discoveries from the past because to them, it might actually be the true path as opposed to the one that we chose. So in some ways, the rabbis say, yeah, our truth too, like scientific truth, is provisional. And so we preserve all of our discussions so that sometime down the line, in fact, we might be disproved and the law might go in a different direction. There's also a wonderful article by Leora Botnitsky that I'm not going to talk about, but I would encourage you to read it. Wendy.
So, yes. So I just want to linger for a moment on Jeff Middleman's assertion about truth in science and Judaism. As our book progressed, as the editing progressed, we were hurled into the worldwide experience of COVID, and the concerns around science and truth were only heightened. The denialism around the vaccines and COVID and so on made this whole issue of science and what science supposedly says about truth all that more significant to us. It was heartening on some level to realize that science and Judaism were not at loggerheads with one another as much as someone might think that faith and that science need to be pitted against one another. According to Jeff Middleman, both science and Judaism assert that truth is this slow-moving work in progress. So it's a process undertaken with humility of progressively trying to get it less wrong. And I mention this because, you know, the chief finding of our book, and we've mentioned this from various perspectives up until now, but I'm going to say it straight, is that in Judaism, while truth is a value, truth is not the only value, and it may not in every case be the most important value. That truth, the Hebrew word for truth being emet, that emet is often a traveler, often has a traveling partner, one or two or three or four partners, other values that truth travels with. And that emet is conditioned and responsive to those other values and in a dynamic relationship with them. Often emet's traveling partner is chesed, kindness. That is, the word emet will frequently appear throughout the Bible and other classical sources in conjunction with chesed, with loving kindness. And this is not an accident. This is because in Judaism, emet is not something that is placed on like a heavenly pedestal above or away from the rest of life. And with this in mind, we went off as we were preparing these book talks and considering how we would present this material to people in different places. I specifically went off to look to see where the word emet actually made its first appearance in the Bible and what that might tell us about its origins, like where the idea of truth in Judaism was born. Normally, if we were all sitting together in a room, this would be the time where I would ask you all to raise your hands and shout out your theories or your best guesses about where you think the word emet, truth, first appears in the Bible. Feel free if you want to hazard your guesses in the chat. I'll see if I can see any of that, or Sarah or Marina, feel free to let me.
We don't have any brave souls yet.
No brave souls yet. In the past, when I've taught this material, people have said, well, maybe the word emet appears in the Garden of Eden, since the truth would seem to be this Edenic notion. Or perhaps the first time we see the word truth would be around the giving of the Torah in Sinai, to be asserting that the Torah is a Torah of truth. Actually, the first appearance of the word emet in the Bible specifically supports this theory about emet, truth, being a traveling partner with other values. So the very, very first place where we see the word emet in the Bible comes tellingly in a very, very long chapter in the book of Genesis, chapter 24. This is the chapter where Abraham's servant, we know from earlier sources in the Bible, Abraham's servant is called Eliezer of Damascus. So let's just say for a moment that that's his name. In this episode, he is left unnamed. Eliezer's the servant of Abraham is sent off to Haran to go get a wife for Abraham's son Isaac. He's given no information about how he should find this person. He's just said, go to where I came from. And therefore, Eliezer the servant has to come up with a whole scheme, has to petition God to give him signs and indications of who the right bride might be. This is the whole thing he stages where the girl in question, the young woman in question, will draw water, not just for him, but also for his camels. He sets up this whole scene. It works out exactly the way he wanted to. And in the end, the servant says, blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his mercy or his kindness and his truth toward my master. So in the very, very first incarnation, the word emet in the Bible is a traveling partner with this notion of kindness, showing us that truth is in some respect, from the very beginning, always in this dialectical relationship with other values. I also note a point that is made over and over and over again in our book, that the etymology of the word emet in the Bible, the etymology of the Hebrew word emet comes from the root aleph mem nun, like amen, like saying amen, which also situates the word emet in a very different lexical space than what we're used to when we think of truth as an empirical, verifiable, scientific fact, like along the order of 2 + 2 is equal to 4, right? An indisputable, irrefutable, immutable notion. Emet in the Bible, in being close to amen, has this additional valence of steadfastness, of trustworthiness, of something akin to operating in good faith. And so it shows in that semantic field that the kind of truth that classical Judaism was operating with was something different than astronomical truth or mathematical truth. Not refuting the idea of that, but that it's trying to situate truth in relation to these other values. So I'm going back to you, Josh.
Sorry, I think we only have about 5 minutes. So instead of looking at Psalm 85, why don't we just skip right to the Midrash, which is really all that matters. Yeah, so we want to show you a passage which honestly I'm not really even sure what it means, and I've done this now 3 or 4 times with Wendy, and each time I think it means something different, but I know that it's some kind of profound statement about the way the rabbis understand what the truth is. So I want to share it with you, give you a couple of ideas that I have. Wendy might want to share, and then you might want to tell us what you think it's actually saying about the way the rabbis conceptualize the truth. So this Midrash is based on the God's creation of the human being. And it imagines that At the time when the Holy Blessed God came to create the first human being, the ministering angels formed themselves into groups, some saying, the human being should not be created. Others were saying, yes, God, create the human being. Now, how do we know that? Because according to Psalm 85, it says, kindness and truth met, justice and peace kissed. So this Midrash is imagining that that line in the Psalms means the angels of kindness and truth and the angels of justice and peace, they were there with God at the moment of creation, weighing in on it. The angel of kindness said, the human being should be created because the human being will do acts of kindness. Seems right. The angel of truth said, the human being should not be created because the human being is full of lies. Yeah, well, that seems true too. The angel of justice said, the human being should be created because the human being will do just acts. That seems true. And the angel of peace said, the human being should not be created because human beings are full of quarrels. Also true. So what did God do with all of these different countervailing arguments before him? God took truth. He didn't say anything. God took the angel of truth and threw the angel of truth down to the ground, which is what it says in Daniel chapter 8, that the truth was thrown down to the ground. But then the other three ministering angels said, God, what are you doing? You are disgracing your order, your stamp, which is truth. Bring truth back from the ground and back up here to heaven. And that is why the Psalm says, the continuation of Psalm 85, that truth will grow from the ground. So there's a lot of interesting things to say about this Midrash and the way that it's manipulating Psalm 85. But the bigger question, I think, is, what is the Midrash trying to say by having this disagreement in heaven, truth being cast down to the ground, and that being the very moment of the creation of human beings? And I want to offer a couple of things, then maybe Wendy will want to say more. But the two things I'll say is that first, if you go and look at Daniel chapter 8, verse 12, at the context of where it says that truth was thrown to the ground, it's actually a reference to Antiochus Epiphanes IV, the evil king on Hanukkah, who destroys the temple in Jerusalem, and that's described as throwing truth to the ground. So here, God, in doing this, is at least tacitly compared to the evil king on Hanukkah destroying the temple in Jerusalem. I'm not sure what to make of that, but it seems rather provocative to me. The second thing, this suggests that while kindness and truth and justice are absolute values that exist only as angels in heaven, the angel of truth is actually not in heaven. The angel of truth is down here with us, growing up from the ground like us, as if there is something that is more human and more fleshy and more tangible and difficult to grasp, maybe even, than the more ideal virtues that are in heaven, like a kindness, truth, and justice. So that would seem to me to be consonant with the idea that not only is truth one of many values in Judaism, it is absolutely not the paramount value in Judaism. And it's the value in Judaism that is the most subject to dispute and discussion because it does not have some objective standard above. That's my reading of the Midrash, but it changes every week. So
I'll add this. I mean, what happens in terms of this exegesis is by alighting on or by fix or ending, the most important thing comes last, according to the rules of rhetoric. So truth in growing from the ground, on the one hand, things grow up. So it's growing in the direction of heaven. It's ever trying to get closer to some sort of ideal or heavenly notion of truth that really is God's precinct. And yet it has to always be rooted in the muck and the mire of this world. It can never be splendidly isolated from all of that. In that sense, it seems as though goodness and kindness are more inviolable. The truth can always be mucked up in response as part of the dialectic with these other values. Now that might make us despair. I mean, if we started out with this project thinking, okay, we're going to study what Judaism has to say about truth, and we're going to get this absolute clarity, we're going to have a way to navigate out of the muck and mire and confusion that we've seen in American politics by way of Judaism, one might say, well, what do we have here? We have an idea that truth can always be sort of finessed or altered in response to other values. Does that not just result in a kind of relativism that is as bad as anything you'll see in the mainstream media? And what I want to suggest about all of this is that Judaism, in saying that truth has to be answerable to goodness, or has to be answerable to kindness, or to notions of peace, it's not compromising on a notion of truth. Rather, it's putting a firewall or a set of tests or barriers or fences even around truth, so that truth is not something that's manipulated for crass personal gain. So if one goes back for a moment to that original instance of truth in the story of the servant of Abraham going to Haran to find a wife for Isaac, that's a journey that's explicitly against self-interest. This is a man who would have otherwise been the inheritor of Abraham's household, and in going to get a wife, a partner for Isaac, is basically cementing the end of what would have been his financial gain from being the trusty steward all these days. And he is going out to fulfill this errand for his master, not for his own personal advancement, but because this is the mission that he was entrusted with. And so the notion of altruism becomes very important when one considers what Judaism's perspective is on truth, I would argue. One can say, well, if truth has to be answerable to goodness, goodness is a relative value. How does that get us away from the squishiness and the muckiness that we've been seeing? And the best that I've been able to come up with all of these presentations and thinking about this is a kind of smell test for truth and goodness as traveling partners. If the goodness that you have in mind in propounding a particular truth only has you to benefit from it, if you're the only one who's going to stand to gain from advancing this idea, then that's not real goodness. That's self-interest. And that's a kind of early baseline foundational teaching that we were able to arrive at by discovering that for Judaism, truth is not the ultimate or sole highest value, but that it's always something that's responsive or in dialogue, in dialectic with other values. Have we reached the end of our time, or do we have...
We have about 5 minutes left, so we can ask a few questions. So we have some questions in the chat. One you kind of spoke to a little bit already, but I would love if both of you have opportunity to elaborate. We sometimes talk about the difference between facts, verifiable events, 2 + 2 = 4, and the truth of a participant or observer's understanding of the facts. Do we lose something when we seek a shared truth, or do we gain something, or both?
Well, we began with the assumption, grounded both in Jewish studies and classical Judaism and in postmodernity, that different people having different perspectives and multiple perspectives, that was the glory and the good, right? That we live in a free world, and a world where no one should dominate another through ideas. And these were the basic truths of our training and our religious conviction. And the concern was that held by a cynical agent, those very ideas can become the ways of splintering societies and dividing and one group against the other. So in that situation, you want to be able to resolve on a few basic immutable facts that everyone can agree upon so that there's a ground that you can stand on. So I would say both. We need to revel in that multiplicity of perspectives, but we have to be able to develop a language to agree on, up is up and down is down, so that we are not upside down. And that's part of and for us, the goodness factor, always factoring in these moral values, we are hoping that can kind of be a way to add some ballast, to add some gravity to the world that seems to be like a gravity-free zone where all ideas are, potentially true.
Gosh, any ideas, thoughts?
Well, I don't want to prevent other questions, so I'm happy to go with Wendy's response if there's another question.
Well, another question that we have here is more of a behind the scenes. How did this book come about? How long did it take to write? And also I would add, in all of the different essays, are there conflicting narratives? Are we seeing more of that Jewish grappling with truth between the different essays in the book?
Well, the book, we didn't really write the book. Let's be clear about that. The book we edited the book. Wendy does have a couple of chapters that she did compose, and we wrote the introduction and that kind of thing. But I mean, these were articles that were submitted by many of the participants in the symposium that was out here in LA. So the whole process from symposium to publication was, I think, 3 years, and it was a lot of work getting the essays in order and whatnot.
There were some participants in the symposium who didn't come through with essays. We commissioned other essays. And then there was COVID in the midst of all of it. So suddenly the whole notion of truth became heightened and complicated in new ways that none of us could have ever anticipated.
Yeah. What was the question that was?
Were there conflicting opinions in the book?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think I mentioned about the different way of looking at prayer that Dahlia Marks and Larry Hoffman give are, I mean, they're conflicting in the sense that they say different things about how we should think about prayer and the relationship of prayer to truth.
Yeah, and in Mark Butler's essay about truth in the Bible, he actually stages a debate and an argument between the different scholars who approach this whole question of whether or not to consider the Bible a repository of lies because of its inconsistencies between sources, the ways in which Deuteronomy or Chronicles revises the earlier sources. Are those sources liars? Are they forgeries of the truth? Are they playing fast and loose with the truth? Or are they moral actors who are actually engaging in a kind of ongoing revelatory process where they're trying to have Torah come closer to the sense of truth that they conceive of, and therefore they are willing to alter.
Yeah. By the way, I should tell you, the foreword for the book was also written by the president of the Hebrew Union College, who is a modern philosopher, political scientist, who is very much committed to what I described as a Greek conception of absolute truth that should be our target. And so his introduction in some ways says, maybe that should be a standard for modern Jews. And so, yeah, there's a lot of different perspectives that you'll find in the pages.
I guess now that we're at the end, I'll leave you with one last question. I guess a call to action. After reading this book, after grappling with all of these biblical references to truth, scientific references, and just Jewish references overall, what can we take away from it, and how should we go about our consumption of media, consumption of truth, lies, alternative facts? What's one takeaway that we can actively use out of this book?
Yeah, this is ask a group of academics how they're going to change and solve one of the greatest problems facing American culture. I would say that in the spirit of pluralism, the book is endorsing the idea of listening and being open to hearing other voices. On the other hand, recognizing the ways in which in our media culture now, taking us back to the Truman Show, and we're acted upon by media. We need to be critical consumers of the media and recognize the ways in which media is playing up truthiness for the sake of ratings and supplying what they think we want to believe. And so there are, not all messages are worth saturating yourself with. You want to know what's going on, but you definitely do not want to be steeping yourself in that media world to the extent that you no longer have can take a critical distance.
I have to have a practical insight. I haven't had a
Final
practical
thought,
insight
yes.
in 47 years. I'll say a couple of things. One is, however unpopular this might be in certain Jewish settings, I would say that people should be equally suspicious, and I think Wendy was saying this, equally suspicious of political discourse that comes from left or right. And I'm not sure there is any political discourse that you shouldn't be suspicious of, precisely because political discourse has an interest that is different from telling the truth. It has the interest of supporting someone's access to power. And I mean, I guess that's kind of a cynical takeaway. So let me give you a less cynical takeaway, which is I think that we should aspire when we are talking, when we're acting, when we're doing anything, to what I might call a measured admiration for the truth. Always starting with the idea that we should seek the truth, we should seek to tell the truth, that is in many ways something to be aspired to. But at the same time, always with the awareness that there are competing values that might have to be considered in a particular moment. So maybe I'll call it a measured admiration for the truth that I think will assist in living a wholesome Jewish ethical life.
Well, thank you both, Rabbis Joshua and Wendy, Rabbi Sarah Berman. I'll have you wrap us all up.
Thank you all so much for being here. Obviously, this is just the beginning of greater thoughts, greater conversation, and engaging with truth and what truth means to us in our world right now. This book, These Truths We Hold, it's a wonderful volume. If you decide to buy it and want to discuss it, just let me know. This summer is a perfect time to do that. Rabbi Dr. Garroway, Rabbi Dr. Zierler, it has been a pleasure having you both and learning from you yet again. Thanks so much for being here and wishing everybody a great night.